Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. This is Curt
And Brad Pinsky.
and we're here for another edition of Fire Law Roundup for October 30th of 2023, just before Halloween.
Happy almost Halloween. Well, Curt, I'm going to call today's session, not that we name them, the I told you so session, because you and I, to our viewers, have been, last week even, we talked about the firefighters rule, and lo and behold, we've got a case. We did a session, I think maybe on fire engineering, but and we talk all the time about how to investigate and who should do investigations. You and I talk about this on this show all the time. And here we go. We got two of those issues are of the five we have today. But let's start in the city of Casper, which is a perfect city to talk about on October 30th.
Well, but it's also, Casper the Ghost, but it's also, to me, I almost titled it, Trouble in Paradise, because it's a beautiful, I grew up in a city, so someplace like Casper, Wyoming would be heaven to me.
True.
But there's trouble in heaven.
I hope not, because the alternative isn't any better. Okay, so here's what we've got. So this was really interesting. This story really is about another story. The story is about a journalistic article about failed investigations within the department. There were some allegations of sexual harassment and some other allegations, and they were investigated within the city. And after the investigation, the city concluded there was, nothing at fault. And then a private investigator was hired. Now, what I don't know is what caused that to happen, but a private investigator was paid $10,000, which is pretty fair, frankly, for an outside investigator to look into the complaint about the behavior. And the interviewer interviewed 20 or so members and concluded that the captain violated the city's sexual harassment and workplace violence or hostility policy. So the article isn't really focusing on the sexual harassment, although certainly talked about it. It's focused on why is there a different result. And you and I constantly talk about who should investigate. And look, let's be fair. You can't have somebody in rank and file who reports to the accuser do an investigation or the accused do the investigation. It's very hard to have the chief or somebody under the chief to do the investigation because the failures might have been of the chief or of one of the others under the chief. So really, it's one thing when you have a large city, you have an HR department, you can have somebody come in. I know you're a fan, you say all the time of internal investigations. Mm-hmm. But in this instance, they show the internal investigation didn't work well or maybe produced a different result. And look, we're assuming the outside investigator was even right, but nonetheless, you got different results. Right. So it kind of goes to my point in a smaller department. Now, this is a city, right? But still in a smaller department, you almost have no choice but to go outside. How do you do it inside?
And you know what? This is, to me, this is why I love the practice of law. Okay, because you and I can disagree over this, and we're still friends. In the firehouse, sometimes when you disagree with somebody, you're like mortal enemies,
Yeah.
And so, I take a different tact, and I kind of prejudice my take on it by basically saying that I don't think outsiders should be investigating firefighters. It's like I don't know enough about how an aircraft carrier works that if I'm going to do an investigation into something that's happening on a naval aircraft carrier, I don't understand the culture, or even worse, a submarine, where there's a culture in there. I've never had to live in a submarine. I've never had to go under the ocean, under the ice cap, and be several hundred feet down, and one little problem, so I don't know the pressures that are on the people that are doing that. Somebody who is familiar with that should be doing the investigation. That's my only point. Now, I agree with you. There are, especially in smaller departments, there may not be someone who is not personally conflicted on it. And that's a good reason to go outside. But I really think to expect that some attorney, some person with a JD who might do a real estate closing, a divorce, an eviction, and then they're going to do an investigation into a firefighter. Give me a break.
You know, it's interesting. I just had a conference this weekend. We had 80 or so people, and we talked about investigations. We, of course, talked about our show, and hopefully people are watching. Hello, if you are. But, you know, one of the things I said is I wouldn't hire an attorney. I mean, it's one thing, you and I, we do these kind of things, right, as a normal course, but that's kind of rare. Most attorneys don't do investigations. And frankly, I said, look, if you can find a retired state trooper or a detective, an investigator, somebody who knows how to not only ask the questions and do the investigation in the right order, but also to record it properly, document it properly. Yeah. But I guess I would retort to your comment. And by the way, let me say, I love disagreeing. Right? We learn, we know,
we're
taught
to do that. We're taught to disagree, and it's okay. It's okay to disagree.
You know, look, I think ignorance is not listening to the other side, right? That's the issue. So, you know, so we get enlightened. But I think that there is a standard of conduct which is acceptable or not acceptable in any environment. And one of the problems in the fire service is, right, we have a skewed standard of what's acceptable or not. And sometimes it does take an outsider to come in and say, this environment is toxic. This environment has lost its way because look what's on TV, or listen to the jokes, or look at these pranks, right? And it seems to become accepted.
But there's two points to that, and one is you and I have talked, and I'm in a graduate program at Arizona State University in forensic psychology, and one of the classes I've already taken, I think you and I have talked about this, is the positive psychology class.
Super interesting.
Okay, and one of the points that I took from that class, and the professor didn't say this out, you know, make the connection of the fire service. I made it, especially with my TA. Who was grading the papers and doing the different things. But there's a treatment that is part of positive psychology called humor therapy. And there's a number of different things. It's good for anxiety. It's good for depression. It's particularly good for PTSD. Okay. If there was one thing that humor therapy can address, it's PTSD. Okay. So now, guess what's been part of fire service culture going back at least 100 years, maybe longer. And it's not just here. I've met firefighters from Japan. I met a firefighter from Iran and North Korea when I was with the NFPA. You know, we're all the same. India, Australia. I mean, we're the same. But humor is in our culture. And someone who doesn't recognize that, and I think the average firefighter without any psychology training knows humor is part of our culture. Dark humor, gallows humor, but it's part of our culture, okay? But it's been like we've been self-medicating, okay? And I think it's healthy. And somebody who's not in our culture is not going to understand that. So that's sort of and we can disagree, put that on the shelf, okay? Yep. The other side of this has to do with the willingness of officers to report misconduct. And when the officers trust the process, they know they're going to get a fair shake, they're more likely to cooperate, and everyone's more likely to cooperate. On the other hand, when they feel like they're pushing one of their subordinates off the plank of the ship, they're more likely to try to cover it up. And what we want is a disciplinary system that the rank and file trust, not necessarily to let somebody off, but that they can trust, and it's going to be managed. Now, if you hire attorney A to do one investigation and they recommend somebody's going to be fired, and then you have another attorney does a very similar investigation and they recommend that just a reprimand, now we've got a consistency problem, and we can't control who is doing these. So I really think going outside should be the exception, not the rule, but there's a skill set that goes along with that.
And can that be the middle line? Because maybe the answer is, Okay, not too outside and not too inside. So maybe the answer is, look, and I know this is so self-serving, but I feel that if you or I came in to investigate, and I do it all the time, or
I do too.
enough of
I do
time,
too.
right? We do. So we have that understanding of what's humorous. Now, some might say, okay, we're already warped, we're already skewed on what's acceptable in the firehouse. I don't think that's true, but I think there is a midline of there could be a good group of people who are outside, but not outside the fire service or outside the fire department or the EMS entity, whatever, but they're not outside the service. So maybe there's the middle line where, you find common ground to say that's how an investigation should be done, because I do agree with you. I question whether it's right, but I do agree with you that somebody on the outside doesn't understand our culture. On the other hand, does that make it legally acceptable, right? If our culture is so improper that that's just accepted, is that acceptable?
Yeah, and I think we can determine that after we have a certain complaint about whatever it may be. Issue A, we have an investigation and we deal with it. And now we have another one, and now we have another one, now we have another one. At some point there may be a need to get an objective set of eyes on that problem. Why is this continuing to happen?
Right.
Okay. But I think there's an awful lot at stake here. And the defect that I see here is that we have a reluctance to deal with discipline. It offends our culture. And one of the reasons is that we're concerned. Like if you and I are firefighters together, and we've worked, and just like I have with so many of my really good friends who may be listening, and we worked as colleagues, same station, we might vacation together. The kids do things together. They are in Little League or they're whatever. And now I've got to report you knowing that it's not going to happen. Right. They've got to trust the system. We have to have a system. This is not unlike what law enforcement went through, and that led to the development of the professional standards concept. Right. And professional standards I don't think is going to work if most of the investigations are done by somebody outside the organization, because the people will not trust it, and consistency will be a problem.
It gives me an idea as we talk, and again, we're all still talking about the journal and the first article here, right, which is about investigations, but it gives me the thought of, could a department, I don't know whether it would match all the laws, but could a department create an internal, confidential stage 1 investigation proceeding where things can be reported and investigated and corrected internally? And the reason I like that is because remember what you and I just talked about last week or the week before, where I said, okay, somebody comes to you and says, I don't want to report this. I'm just telling you about sexual harassment, but I don't want to do anything about it. If there was that kind of middle ground where it was confidential, would be dealt with properly, but not publicly, it would stop the conduct, maybe more people would come forward. Maybe they'd come forward sooner. Maybe more people would trust the process. And I would call that like a stage 1 grievance procedure, right?
Well, and I would just say that's how we should handle anything. Now, there are certain types of investigations that could lead to termination, that could involve criminal conduct. Those have to be handled in a different manner. But again, what I teach in my discipline class is sort of an overall process. That starts with, we want to have someone in the organization that's the point person, not the fire chief. So we're talking about usually a 4-bugle deputy chief, but they don't do the investigations necessarily. They sort of quarterback it. And the complaints go to this person. That person then makes the decision on, number 1, are we going to investigate it? Number 2, how are we going to investigate it? Is it going to be formal, informal? We're going to take recorded statements? Are we just going to ask for written statements and all that? And by doing that, it's centralized so that you're not getting a lot of inconsistency with that. Okay. Right. And then the third and the most important one that I think addresses your concerns is who is going to. And so there may be circumstances where we need to go outside. I don't mean that we never go outside. There are certain circumstances we need to, but you want to make sure that someone who is involved in the allegations, somebody's going to be a witness. Certainly somebody's accused, okay? Right. But at the same time, we don't want the victim doing the investigation. No. And that kind of ties back into this, because it seems like Casper had some procedures that said that when someone makes a complaint about sexual harassment, it will be investigated. Well, guess what? Who is going to do the investigation? It doesn't say.
Right.
Okay. It doesn't say a battalion chief. It doesn't say a deputy chief. It doesn't say we're going to have a chief of professional standards that then is going to make the determination, so that we don't have somebody who's got a stake in the outcome involved in doing the investigation. So we really want that quarterback there, the chief of professional standards, to be in the position of overseeing it, assigning the investigators, making sure the progress is moving along, and so on. So obviously I feel passionate about it. Okay. And I think, and I didn't invent it. I know the person who invented it. A guy who was a captain in the Los Angeles City Police Department after Rodney King. And it developed out of there in response to the Rodney King incident. And it was a recognition that law enforcement was struggling to deal with how did Rodney King happen? It happened because officers were looking the other way at other misconduct, that their culture was stronger than their overall big picture obligation, and that the department was ignoring complaints about this very behavior. So again, a lot of the things that we see, I don't want to belabor that, but
no.
you know,
And I'll just make my two final points and kind of, we'll move on. But, one is, everyone should remember, the point of investigation is not necessarily determine anything. It's to determine the facts, right? Get the facts. The conclusions are a different issue. The investigator determines the facts. So there shouldn't be, I mean, yes, you can definitely have fact investigation biases, right? No question, but, who you believe what. But if you just put down the facts, let somebody else determine what's true or not, is one of the things. And, the other part is, I kind of look at it like a doctor shouldn't give injections to their child, right? To their own childs, because, and this is
a lawyer shouldn't do wills for his family members.
Yeah, kind of, but you shouldn't create harm. Well, it's not the bias issue. It's, you don't want to cause pain. You don't want the parent causing pain to the child.
Right.
And to me, it's kind of the same thing. The assistant chief investigating, one of his captains or firefighters is kind of difficult, because I'm the disciplinarian, which you are as a chief, period. But now I'm investigating something sensitive. And then we go out on the fire ground, right? And it's a trust issue. So I kind of, but that's easy in a big department. That's not easy in a small department. But I don't disagree with you. I think that we just got to find a way in the fire service and start giving a uniform way for these investigations to handle. I do agree outsiders aren't necessarily the best people to do it. Yeah. Okay, let's go to Ohio. This is really interesting. There's a conflicting fact, which is a huge conflicting fact, I noticed. But we have a Columbus firefighter who's charged with vehicular homicide, right? This for causing, allegedly, the death of somebody who rear-ended him. Now, the firefighter was heading down the highway, was in the right lane. I'll give you the factual issue that I saw between the news report and the written report, but the firefighter driving engine in a, I assume 55 or 65 mile an hour highway, was going 24 miles an hour, goes over 1 to 2 lanes to turn around. The fact that I'm not sure is, and don't say anything yet because I want to put one more fact in, is whether he had his lights and sirens on. The news report said he did. That's what's interesting. I watched it 3 times to make sure I heard it right. It was reported on the video you linked to that he in fact did have his lights and sirens on. Obviously, that's a huge issue.
Absolutely. I think that's the case right there. If he had his lights and siren on, that's an entirely different case.
Yeah, the news says he did. You said he didn't. I'm assuming he didn't.
The written article said he didn't, and I looked for that. I must have missed it in the video. So, but that's obviously a huge issue. And if his lights and siren was on, there's no reason why he should be charged here. I can't. I wouldn't understand that. But the write-up said he did not have them on.
Yeah, so that's where I was a little confused. I assume he didn't, but I don't want to make any assumptions. In any event, a guy coming up 74 miles an hour, so either 20 or 10, miles an hour over the speed limit. I don't know what the speed was, but rear ends the engine. So I personally don't care how slow, granted it's dangerous, right? How slow the fire engine was going, somebody rear-ended him. Now, if he sideswiped him as he comes over, I would have an easier time with this. I personally am having a hard time with, look, was he negligent? Sure. But was he criminally negligent? I'm having a hard time with that fact. But in any event, the driver was killed. And you know, it's hard to understand. Yes, he had maybe he has his warning lights off, which is clearly negligent. I just don't get criminal out of it. I don't know. He's a 25-year-old driver.
Point is, he's on the highway, but he's trying to apparently get to a left lane turnaround, an emergency turnaround to return back from the direction that he started from. And I think you're absolutely right. If he's got his lights on now, especially, I mean, you could argue here a point. Was he responding to an alarm with his lights on? Okay. What if he wasn't? What if he just turned them on? And this is where the state laws are a little bit ambiguous about, can we use our lights and siren when we're not responding, or is it only when we're responding? So the state laws in each jurisdiction are slightly different. And I haven't researched Ohio's laws on that, but.
Yeah. And it seems to me, if he was, the way I think of this, the way it's described, and this may not be what happened, it sounds like he's turning around in the median to go the other way on the highway,
exactly, in
a U-turn, no U-turn lane that's meant for cops.
Or emergency vehicles only, right?
Yeah, but here, are they an emergency vehicle? Was he allowed to use that? If he's not going to an emergency, was it safe and prudent?
I don't know, is a police car an emergency vehicle when they're setting up to do a radar trap?
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, they're all good questions, but those U-turn lanes are meant for them, whether they're meant for, you know, and the fire truck didn't even need to do that. Was it so dangerous? But again, to me, that's a negligence issue. Sure, he appears to be negligent, but criminally negligent. Just because someone died doesn't make our acts worse. And we'll talk about that when we talk about some of the wildfire stuff coming up. But anyway, it's a very interesting case. But I think especially if you're a first or you're a new user, a viewer, this is not unique. You know, we've covered 3 or so, one of them kept coming up, but we've covered 3 or so incidents, and that's only because you're just choosing new ones, right?
I would bet about at least 10 to 12 a year. Firefighters are charged with some sort of homicide related charge related to either apparatus accident or something in the nature that leads to a fatality.
Yeah, and I think people driving have to understand that that driving an emergency vehicle, especially in some states, can come with it, right, a criminal sentence. So you end somebody else's life, the justice system may, quote unquote, end yours. So let's, people drive with the due regard for the caution of others. And, I'm not saying don't speed, but and things like that. I'm just saying, you don't take risks when you don't need to take risks. And the level of risks is, I don't know, maybe per call, but in any event, people need to drive understanding that they could face criminal charges.
Yeah. This isn't unique. It does happen, and we do see it. So
yeah, and in fact, there's almost nothing unique on this show anymore. In some variation, right?
There's some variations. There's some.
There's just so many things that happen routinely, just differently. Okay, so let's go to Florida. I'm going to summarize this. I don't think we need to spend a long time on it. It's very specific, but there was a question that a Florida firefighter had, I didn't have to say, developed cancer, but, had cancer. And there wasn't a real question of line of duty. It was just a question of whether the workers' comp benefits and other death benefits were mutually exclusive. In other words, could you get both?
Yeah. When he was alive, there was a couple of laws in there. You can see it in the article, but section 112.18162 provided that a firefighter with cancer while alive could opt for certain benefits. And then the question was, if during the firefighter's life, if they opted for those benefits, would they then be excluded from getting workers' comp benefits. And that was the same issue.
And he lost at the comp level. He lost at the trial court level, but the appeals court comes out and says, wait, this is super clear, straightforward. The statute is unambiguous. I think when they do that, what they mean to say, these higher level courts, is to the trial court, why don't you read more carefully? I think they're sending a message to the trial court that this was plain language, not confusing. You should have known better. And they did a nice detailed analysis, but said they're not mutually exclusive benefits. You can get both. So it's very specific to Florida, but the point I think we should make to everybody is, listen, just because the comp board, who I don't trust at all, says anything does not mean you should ever trust them. And you should, challenge, if you think there's good faith to do so, you should challenge the comp board decisions, because routinely we find them incorrect.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to kind of move past that a little bit on the interesting level to the U.S. Forest Service. This is a great, interesting case. I'll take issue with it in a moment, but so here's basically what happened. We had a fire in New Mexico. It's the largest wildfire in New Mexico. The U.S. Forest Service was doing some controlled, prescribed burns. They had, I think, if I believe what's in the complaint, they did admit fault that they allowed it to get out of control, or it did get out of control. They said it was their prescribed burn and got out of control. So that fire merges with the California fire. In any event, that fire was not contained until August 21st. But a month or so earlier, we're back in 22, so everyone knows, a month or so earlier, we have torrential downpours. And there was an area, or large area, swath of land, where there's no more vegetation and it can't control the flooding. And there's a flash flood in the area, and people died. And this is, the relatives are suing on behalf of the families of 3 people who died, or on behalf of the 3 people who died. And the fire service is charged with, first, you screwed up because you burnt too much, right?
You caused the fire. You caused
the fire. Okay. But that's not really the issue. The issue then is, you created a dangerous situation. You didn't warn anybody that if there was a flash flood, you could be in trouble. You need to, get out of the area, and that the flash flooding then kills somebody, and it would not have happened but for this fire, right? There's a lot of cause. Right? They talk about it. Is it a burn scar? Is that what they use as this kind of vacant area where there's no trees and vegetation to stop the rain that ultimately killed the people? My issue with this, so again, simple facts, you caused a fire, you admit you caused a fire, the fire takes away vegetation that would have limited the harshness, the danger of the torrential downpours and flooding. Let's assume for the moment they can prove that. Let's assume they can prove it. I'm happy to accept that some expert is going to come forward saying, look at the water patterns. This is a tree density. It would have been broken up, whatever. The question really is proximate cause. And you might as well call me proximate cause Pinsky, because that's what I always am looking for is, fine, maybe you had a duty, you breached a duty. PCP, yeah, which is my father's initials. Anyway, but maybe, if you had a duty, you breached a duty, right? But then, was that breach of duty causing the fire which took away the vegetation? Was that the proximate cause of the people's deaths? There was a torrential downpour you could not have predicted. At least a month earlier or 2 months earlier, or when the fire started, right? You couldn't have predicted that there would be a torrential downpour. Maybe there was a high likelihood. Maybe it was so likely you should have known. But then to know where the runoff's going to go and how it's going to affect somebody, I mean, to me, that seems like a very tough road to hoe. Now, in truth, what's going to happen, my belief, there's going to be exchange of expert witness reports. They're going to say, I can prove it. Here's the map. And they're going to settle the darn thing. But this to say that a fire, and they're not saying they didn't handle the fire properly. Like a week or a couple weeks ago, we have a case where, right, they didn't handle the fire properly.
Well,
that's very different.
Yeah, they threw the kitchen sink. I don't know if you could, if you scroll down on the article, they list they probably list about 15 different acts of negligence. And I think probably 3/4 of those fit right in with PCP. Okay. There's no probable cause. There's absolutely no, failing to follow the mandated directives in planning of prescribed burns, not even the lighting of just the planning. Okay.
But the
failing
last one is the big one, though.
Huh?
Right. The last one was just failing to provide adequate warnings to decedents regarding the dangers of potential flash flooding in the area.
Right.
That's the only one I could really get my hands around to say, okay, should you have known? Now, look, I'm not a wildland guy. I've done the fires. You just did a huge fire, right? But I'm not a wildland guy, despite I've done wildland fires.
I'm not either. I'm not. One fire doesn't make somebody an expert.
Despite what everyone thinks, right? And training fires certainly don't make anyone an expert.
Right.
So, but that said, maybe there is a way to predict it. But they're still in the midst of fighting the fire when this is going on. The fire's not under control for a month later. So I don't know, resources. Did you have time to do these evaluations? There's a lot into this. I just think it's very interesting that, take the general question, when a fire department does something that creates a possibility of injury, a month, 2 months, or maybe never are reliable for it. And what's
interesting is the fire was still apparently not under control, or I don't know if it was under control or not contained, or not. What was the term that they used? The fire was not fully contained.
It was a month later.
Yeah, so the fire was still active at the time of the flood, which I think I would feel more comfortable in saying there's no duty. If the fire had happened, like if the fire had happened in April and it was out by May, and this happened in July, but the fire happened in April, and now, was it April? I think it was. And then,
April 6th. Yeah.
And then, but it wasn't contained. It was still active in July when this happened. I don't know. I think that's a slight change, but again, I agree. I think there's a proximate cause issue that's going to run throughout this. Yeah. So I can't believe, I gotta believe the U.S. Forest Service must have a team of attorneys. I mean, they must have a division of attorneys. They are constantly getting sued,
especially now. Right, we have seen such a huge uptick, not just against the fire service itself, but also like the electric companies in Hawaii and all these places where they're coming after us for wildland fires. What the problem is, you can't have it both ways, right? So in Canada, the Canadian wildfires were significantly bigger than they should have been because they don't manage the foliage, right? They don't take care of the underbrush. It's just too vast, and they don't dedicate the resources. Mm-hmm. And they can't face liability for that because, well, they're Canada. I don't know what they are, but generally municipalities don't face liability if they don't have the financial resources, or otherwise, divert the financial resources somewhere else. But then here we have, okay, they did do something they admit wrong, right? The fire got out of control, whatever our fault, but still, does that mean they're liable for everything else that happens down the road? This is, I don't know why this didn't dawn on me before. Okay. But we should have pointed this out before. When there is a declaration of emergency or a declaration of a disaster, one could be not so much local, but when there's a state declaration of emergency, state statutory immunity kicks in. Okay. And then when there's a federal declaration, and again, I don't know if I'm assuming there had to be at least a state declaration here, but when there's a federal declaration, federal immunity kicks in. And those who are responsible for managing the incident, responding, they're immune. It's one of the most comprehensive protective immunity protections. Of course, here they started the condition.
Yeah, right. So maybe that's going to be, we'll talk about what happens when you start the fire in the next thing we talk about with regard to the fireman's rule. But at least here, when there is a declaration of emergency or declaration of a disaster, there could be state immunity as well as federal immunity for tort. And it's very, very important because, think about, folks who respond in hurricane prone areas, Syracuse not being one of them, but up the coast, when you say once the winds get to 70 miles an hour, we're not going to respond.
Right.
Well, this provides immunity, that statute provides immunity protection. So just curious, I'm wondering if whether or not that immunity protection might kick in here.
I had a different thought, which was, don't they normally issue evacuation orders when these fires are happening?
Yeah.
Did they issue an evacuation order, and did the families ignore the evacuation order? If so, assumption of risk, you get what's coming to you. I hate to say it, but that's, that could be a defense. But to your point, we will see if what's followed up now is a motion to dismiss, if it's federal court, 12B6 or 12B2, whatever, motion to dismiss based on immunities or anything else. So that should come out soon. I presume we'll see that. Let's go to the most interesting one, or certainly most interesting one, to Indiana.
Well, yeah, it certainly is. So let me just get my my latest.
And as you're pulling it up, let me tell all the viewers, we talked about this last week. We talked, not because there was an actual fireman's rule case, right? We brought it up and talked a lot about the fireman's rule, and we're saying, isn't it possible it could have been raised then? And we talked about the fireman's rule, and here you go, 1 week later.
Yeah, and interesting case out of Fort Wayne. We had a Fort Wayne fire captain who was injured at a commercial building fire. The building was owned by a real estate company, Sweet Real Estate, but it was leased to a company called Vehicular, and they rented scooters. Now, I'm going to make an assumption here, but I'm assuming it's lithium-ion batteries. So I'm not positive, but I'm making that assumption. But at any rate, the fire, you know what? The complaint never mentioned lithium-ion batteries. So maybe it wasn't. I don't know.
It should have, because it's maybe they didn't know it's such a high probability of starting these fires.
But at any rate, they got a fire that started in a battery, and a certain captain, Captain Richard Dolson, was injured when he, and the fire was in 2022, when he fell through. There was an unfinished wall where it just had studs, and he apparently...
And not properly spaced studs.
Right. They had removed one of the studs, so he must have been sort of feeling his way along in zero visibility, and then went through and fell down a stairwell and was pretty badly injured. So he sued the tenant as well as the property owner for negligence. And part of his allegations, I cut out some of the factual details. It got a little bit extensive there, but essentially he was alleging that they had the opportunity to warn the incident commander, and because he was in communication with the incident commander by radio, all the incident commander would have had to do was to notify him that there was a danger due to the missing stud, which it seems kind of a little on the precise side. But at any rate, that there was a danger. He was not alerted to that, and that the property owner and the tenant both had a duty to inform him of the danger, and that they were negligent, negligent, number one, in removing the stud, and also number two, in not warning him about it, and therefore he was suing. The real estate company and Vehicular both filed a motion to dismiss, or motion for summary judgment, based on the fireman's rule that says that you're a firefighter, you go to a building, you get hurt, you're not entitled to sue anyone for that. You've got your workers' comp, and there's a lot of reasons for that fireman's rule. One of which is people may hesitate to call 911 if they think they're going to somehow create liability for themselves by calling. They may try to put it out themselves. And also, people pay taxes. Why should they have to pay taxes plus be subject to these kinds of suits? And assumption of risk, which you kind of mentioned before. So you have all those things kind of circling around in the background. The trial court agrees with the property owner and dismisses the case. Okay. And the Captain Dolson, then appeals to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals reverses and said that, yes, Indiana recognizes the fireman's rule, and the fireman's rule prohibits firefighters from suing when they're hurt at an incident, but it's narrow, and every state's slightly different. This is what we talked about last week.
Yep.
Every state is slightly different on its interpretation of the fireman's rule. And in this particular case, they say Indiana's fireman's rule only applies to someone whose negligence caused the fire. And in this case, there is no allegation that the property owner or the VO ride caused the fire. The negligence here was in how they were maintaining their property. Now, there's other states where this would be covered by their fireman's rule, but in Indiana, it's only limited to suing somebody who is responsible for causing the fire, whose negligence leads to the fire. And the Court of Appeals reinstated the case, and now it's going to go back to the trial court for further proceedings. So
yeah, and let me just kind of phrase it a different way, right?
Yeah.
Here, if you have a property in a dangerous condition, such that when a firefighter enters the property, they are deemed to be what's called an invitee, as the court suggests, a guest. And so when you intentionally or unintentionally invite someone into your house, right? In this case, unintentionally, but you still invited them because you created a condition that called them in, and you have a effective trap, a dangerous condition, you're going to be liable just like you would to any other guest. So I agree with the court, and I think it's probably more of the statutes, right? So firefighters' rule is normally created by courts, not statute. And then they bring in statutes, laws to get rid of the firefighters' rule or modify it in some way. And I agree with this court, maybe because it's what I'm used to, but yeah, if you cause the fire, you're not liable for that. That's accidental, right? But you don't owe a duty to anyone not to cause a fire necessarily. But when you have a dangerous condition on your property and you invite people in, you're responsible for the dangerous condition. And that could be ice on the driveway right? 3 days after the storm, there's still ice on the driveway. And look, I think it's right. I think it's fair, not just for the firefighter, but and we think this way as firefighters, not as public. You need to leave your house in a condition that there's a fire, right? I never block our exits. We sleep with the doors closed, right? In case there's a fire, the bedroom doors are closed. I mean, firefighters think of these things. We wouldn't leave a gaping hole in the middle of our house just because you could walk around it. We wouldn't start a motorcycle repair business in our basement. We generally think of, oh my God, there could be a fire, so let's leave our house in a condition to get out and so others don't get hurt. Most people don't think of it that way. But, I go to Black Sunday. I go back to Black Sunday where it didn't turn out the way it should have. Let's be fair, right? The landlord should have been in jail and whatever, but where you cut up your house and you create such a dangerous condition to the firefighters, where going into a fire, it becomes very dangerous. They didn't know what it was supposed to look like. It wasn't in code. It was a dangerous condition. The landowner should be liable for that. I don't care whether it's the mailman who comes in, whether it's a delivery guy, whether it's your brother or sister, or it's the firefighter. You invite them in for any reason, intentionally or unintentionally, you should be liable for the dangerous condition you allowed to exist. Period. Because you know darn well, when we don't go in because there are dangerous conditions, they sue us. Oh, I was a hoarder house, but so what? We're going to sue you. You didn't put out the fire. Well, guess what? Fair play on the other end. You invite us in, there's dangerous condition, and we go in, you should be liable. So firefighters are not using these types of statutes enough when they exist, right? I don't know if you've studied how many states have them, but we're not using these to our advantage enough because we're just not aware of them.
Yeah, I do know there's about a dozen states that have eliminated the firefighters rule. So
New York is one of them. And
yeah. So, and I support that. I think that's the right direction. Not that we want to be overly litigious on every fire, but we want to make sure, because it serves a function in getting people to maintain their property. And I think that's what you were kind of getting at, that, you can't be neglectful in how you maintain your property. And then say, oh, well, they as part of the risks of their job. No, some of it is. Certainly some things are within the risk, but there's other things that are outside of what we should have to encounter in our daily activities as firefighters.
Exactly.
So interesting case. So,
and we told you so. We talked about it last week. We said it was coming, and there's another one.
Yep, there we go. All right. Well, that's going to do it for another week of Fire Law Roundup. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. Please click like and share. We finally have made it, I guess you'd say, into YouTube's big time. So you're going to start seeing ads showing up. I apologize for that, but you know, it's hopefully going to offset some of our costs that are associated with you know, what we're doing here, and we love doing it. So, you know, we want to keep doing it, but please bear with the ads. My apologies, but part of life today, I guess. All right, Brad, that'll do it for another edition of Fire Law Roundup.
Happy Halloween.
See you next week. Yeah, happy Halloween.